Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and we get together at such an amazing moment, not just here, but really around the world, as we open our eyes to an exceptional challenge, a defining one, and hopefully come together to come out the other end stronger than we were going in. Here in the United States, the president, as you all know, has passed historic legislation and taken broad, sweeping action on climate to position the U.S. for that leadership. Over the last several years, we've seen a massive expansion in capital formation in the industries that will source the sustainability solutions that we so desperately need. And we've seen project development really take off across the country. And that really, I think, has translated into a visible difference, really big things happening all across the country. I was recently in Georgia, where 2 gigawatts of new nuclear are coming online, and it's part of a real renaissance in that industry coast to coast. I was meeting with folks, union workers, who are building 2 gigawatts of offshore wind off the coast of Virginia, something that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago when offshore wind was just a glimmer in the eye staring at the coastline. Now steel going in the water and electricity flowing onto the grid. I've met with some of our indigenous communities, as well as folks in the solar industry who are building 2 gigawatts of transmission capacity to move the power of the sun as it shines in New Mexico to power the bright lights of the city of LA. 2 gigawatts is the size of the Hoover Dam. It defined a whole generation of building. Each of those efforts is 2 gigawatts. And all across the country, we are taking on this challenge in a massive way. We have not seen a shrinking of our imaginations over the last several decades. We've actually seen a massive expansion in our capacity to both imagine and to build. And not only are we deploying those technologies, we've seen America become the factory floor for this transformation. In Dalton, Georgia, where they used to be the sofa-making capital of the world, they're now manufacturing solar. In Weirton, West Virginia, where they had shuttered a steel plant, they've turned that back on, returning money to the tax base and putting more storage units into the marketplace. And in Belvedere, where they used to make the internal combustion engine and the supply chain, therefore, they are now transitioning to power and electric transformation in the transportation sector that's made in America. New fuels, hydrogen, sustainable aviation, new platforms, VCM, CBAM, new ambitions, climate smart, not just in the power sector and in transportation, but in agriculture. The 80,000 farms, the 75 million acres signed up for climate smart agriculture, new ambitions in the industrial sector. David Crane here, you'll hear from in a little bit, billions of dollars to help transform steel and cement and actually stand up the first aluminum smelter in the United States in a generation. 3 big things that I think we've got to be clear-eyed about as we chase down this moment of opportunity. The first is that our ability to accelerate progress, in my humble view, is predicated on our ability to see and speak clearly about the nature of the threat. America didn't get to the moon by denying it was there. We got there by recognizing the science, seeing the opportunity, and leaning in to the competition with partners around the world. And we got the job done. You know, a lot of you probably get some of this on a day-to-day basis where people say, hey, you know, maybe do the stuff, but don't talk about how this is connected to something that has become polarized in our public discourse. I think that's a big problem. I don't think we move as quickly as we need to, and with a full sense of the considerations of what everybody is up against if we don't connect the dots between what we are doing and what we are up against. The second big thing is supply chain risk is climate risk. For those of you who fill out your disclosure forms at the end of the year, you already know this because hopefully you have good counsel. But we saw this reality as factories idled all across the country a few summers ago because we had ceded our semiconductor advantage and the entire capability to produce those chips to nations overseas. And that supply chain got concentrated and it became vulnerable. We have to, in this decisive decade for climate action, ensure that we have a diverse supply chain, a resilient supply chain, and one that will carry us the full distance, as opposed to being a reason we have to pump the brakes or idle or slow down, which we cannot afford to do. And the last, and I think this is so critical, you'll hopefully hear about this from a number of the folks from the Biden administration that are part of the panels, but hopefully this is something that's very much integrated in how you think about sustainability. Social license and policy matters in this transformation. We're talking about new stuff. New stuff is sometimes really scary to people for good reason. We've got the legacy of bad industrial decisions, infrastructure build out without thinking through all of the consequences littered all across the country. And there are communities that have lived with that for generations. We cannot create that as we try to solve the biggest challenge that's in front of us. The way we do the work we need to do actually matters a whole lot. This is a moment we're called on not just to be the sort of greenhouse gas accountants that the climate science demands, but also people who are focused on the middle class, focused on the global south, focused on environmental justice, focused on getting our decisions to represent the full set of values and considerations that make us proud of who we are. So we are in an incredible moment, and I am very grateful to be part of this conversation.
Great. Thank you. Terrific. So thank you for those opening comments. I was going to start by saying, last time we were together in person, you were kind enough to have me over at the Oval Office and in your office there. It was in the wake of the passage of the IRA, and I wrote an in-depth profile in The Economist about that legislation, arguing this is the most important climate legislation, really the three laws taken together, resetting the frame, setting an agenda for investment in the U.S. And I was going to ask you, how's it going? But you've given us a part of the answer already. But you also did part of my work for me, that is pointing out three challenges. So maybe we can skip right to the good part. Let's get to the tough questions. You talked about, first and foremost, I've noted down here, green hushing. Don't do it. That's the journalist's way of saying what you said, and that is, we need to speak clearly about the nature of the threat. You invoked the moonshot, of course, which is often done. But in particular, you said we need to talk about it openly, but again, being close to this community and following this, and you'll know this, even Harry in the opening talked about there's something of an ESG backlash at the moment. It's no big secret about that. It is a challenging time to be a chief sustainability officer or someone in that kind of position, the C-suite dealing with these issues. And we have seen from claims of greenwashing to now green hushing, companies even wanting to do the right thing, keeping quiet about it. What do you say to those in this room who say, look, this is what you're saying sounds great, but you're a politician, you can do that, or you're a policy man. I got to deal with my board, I've got investors, I've got, maybe I'm in a red state, my company has operations there, and AG's coming after us. What do you say to people who say, I can't be your frontline warrior, I want to do the right thing, but I can't be out there talking about climate every day?
Yeah, look, I think that's just doesn't add up in the long run. I think that might be a sustainable short-term strategy, but I think it gets you off course. And I say this as someone who's counseled LPs, worked with boards on how to discharge their fiduciary duties, you think, number one, about the vectors of risk that show up in the physical environment. They translate into the real economy, and they show up on your balance sheet. If you're not thinking about climate change, you're not thinking about the very new and path-breaking research on the impacts of extreme heat on economic productivity. You're not thinking about what that does to the performance of your transmission line or what it will do to the performance of the new turbine that you just bought. If you're not following the thread, then you don't understand the threat of sea level rise in terms of the placement of your most valuable assets or your real property, what that will do to the insurability and the bankability of what you're trying to build. So I think understanding the risk is actually absolutely critical, even as, just because it's a solar panel doesn't mean it's impervious to the challenges that are presented by the climate crisis. That's number one. I think number two is know where you are drawing the political economy, and I don't mean that in the partisan politics sense, but the political economy to propel your business case. There's a reason we passed 10-year tax credits in clean energy and in clean manufacturing. There's a reason we've been able to set standards and redefine how the government does procurement. It's because we're chasing after a goal. If collectively we undermine our commitment to that goal, we are at the same time collectively undermining the tools that you are all harnessing and now building entire business models after. So, I give you maybe a small example of this is sustainable aviation fuel. That's probably something a lot of you are tracking, some of you are buying, and very few of you are producing. And someone thought that was funny, and I do too. But look, we've got, we went to Congress and we just got a few years of tax credit on that. You think if we go back to Congress and we've stopped thinking climate change is the problem, we can't name it, we can't call it out, we're going to be expanding a whole new way of producing fuel in the face of a lobby that doesn't want competition? No, we're not going to do that. There is a consensus in the world, forged in Dubai, all the nations of the world that recognize there's a crisis. We got to triple nuclear, we got to triple efficiency, we got to triple renewables. We also have to, as a globe, phase out our reliance on fossil fuels. This is a bundled package, and I think pulling the sort of sticks out of the bundle undermines the efficacy of the overall enterprise.
Okay. You talked about supply chains and risk, which is the second of the issues that you talked about, and how, of course, the investments in the CHIPS Act and some of the other aspects of the legislation that we've discussed builds up domestic supply chains that had been perhaps neglected or yielded to foreigners. But I do want to talk about the tension that's involved with trade. It has been noted, of course, one of the first rules in economics is there's no free lunch, right? There are trade-offs. Yeah. And in trying to build up this domestic resilience, domestic industries, the kind of tariffs that have been imposed, whether it's on Chinese solar supplies or EVs or others, doesn't this raise the cost of building these industries at a time when we need to double down and accelerate investments in climate, that it slows down climate action in order to achieve another worthy goal? And there may be aspects of the supply chain that don't make sense to replicate. Every small widget that goes into making solar panels does not have to be made in America, at least not in the short term. So how do you deal with this inevitable trade-offs that are involved in policy? In this case, we're talking about trade. But there are other elements of your legislation that has been passed that also involves, say, good jobs for environmental justice or minority communities or other domestic content provisions that pose challenges as you go along, where companies are saying this is imposing costs on us that are becoming unsupportable. What do you say to your constituents when they bring that to you? Yeah, well, I have a macro response, and then there's on trade, I think, a little bit more of a double click. So, look, I think there is a
penny wise, pound foolish version of tackling the climate crisis. You buy a bunch of cheap stuff and then you realize you can't buy it anymore. It's not available. That's what we saw in chips, and I think that's a story that we started to repeat in solar. We've seen it play out in batteries, and that's a really big risk when you need not just the United States, not just China, but the world to be on a sustained and accelerating trajectory for decarbonization. Being vulnerable to holdup, being vulnerable to a setback devastating that entire enterprise is a really big problem. So I think that there's a part of this that is made in America and harnessing everything we can to extract the maximum economic upside for the American people, bring as much value here as possible. But there's a broader thesis here, which is in the decisive decade for climate action, we need a resilient and diverse supply chain so that we don't get stuck or stall out. And I think that is not a trade-off. That is a little bit more far-sighted than the short-sighted penny-wise, pound-foolish. I think on trade policy as a bigger or a sort of a distinct piece, we've got to be able to, and I'm helping lead with our economic team and our national security team an effort to embed these considerations in our trade policy. And the sort of old school version of this is just trying to level the playing field, right? And that's we've taken a lot of effort to try to do that. But the next version of it is to level it up, to see the embodied carbon. And this goes to the true costs of the products that we're bringing in. So you look at a solar panel, which is mostly aluminum, and that aluminum is twice as dirty in a jurisdiction like China. You're importing a bunch of emissions while you're trying to solve the climate crisis. You're not doing your true
it's
value.
The carbon dumping problem, right?
Exactly.
And efforts like CBAM in Europe are trying to get at it.
Exactly.
Do you support, or does the administration support, a U.S. equivalent of that going forward for this exact reason?
We support policy at the border in trade that helps account for the structural differences on the embodied carbon and the value that's being shipped across borders, recognizing it and appreciating in economic terms.
Okay. Well, I know there's bipartisan support for something like that. Maybe we'll see something in the future. The last point you talked about is social license, and maybe we can end on this point because we're running out of time. The new stuff is scary, as you said, but also, industrial investments haven't always been done thoughtfully, respectful of communities. But this is an era where clearly we need to build. Right? We need to build a lot of infrastructure for the new energy economy. And industrial policy doesn't have a great record. It's not just the stuff that you talked about in the US, in Europe, in other countries, industrial policy where enlightened planners sitting in the White House or in Congress or at state capitals in Europe didn't get it right in the 70s or 80s. In Brazil, in the 80s, they had an informatics law where they thought, IT, we can go on our own, forget the Microsofts. And of course, a decade later, they're a decade behind the rest of the world and had to catch up. So how do you resolve this tension when you're trying to win over popular support, that social license and the need to build more at a time where sometimes making decisions centrally is not always the best way? How do you win people's trust?
I think you've got to be dedicated to a tech-neutral, performance-based approach. You look at the tax code, our clean energy credits are transitioning to tech-neutral. We're focused on the emissions, not the platform that you bring to reduce them. We define the problem and then we encourage the market to chase after it. You think about the transmission corridors that the Department of Energy has designated. We looked at where the grid needs the help and then we put that to the market. Now, whether people want to come forward with reconductoring plays or they want to bury the lines or they don't, or they want to get very aggressive about non-wires in those areas and use wires with greater efficiency. That's sort of up to them, but we've got to define that. You think about the transportation revolution. Again, we don't care if it's hybrid or biofuels or fully electric. In fact, the tax credits that we have Whether you're purchasing hydrogen or a plug-in hybrid or fully electric, you get all of those. And then you think about something like the 45X tax credit on the manufacturing side. Incredibly flexible. If the market decides to surge to build out more electrolyzers than we anticipated, there's no central planning quota. The IRA is designed as a really elastic partner that will move with the market. So we've got to define the goal. And this goes to maybe to close where I started. We've got to see and call out very clearly the challenge we're up against, and we've got to run at the pace we need to get the job done.
All right, Ali, we'll give you the last word on that. Thank you for being with us. Everyone, give him a nice round of applause. We appreciate it.
Really appreciate it.